Hello and welcome to Revit Auto. Today we're going to do a front pads and rotor service on this 2013 Ford E350. We're out here at Holy Cross working on one of their buses, so let's get after it. So tools for today's job is a 3-foot pry bar, a 1/2-inch Milwaukee. I got a big set of channel lock pliers for removing a grease cap. This is our seal installer. I got a small pair of needle nose pliers and a 4-pound hammer. I have a 1/2-inch 27, 22, 21, and 13 millimeter sockets, a 1/2-inch torque wrench. I have a 13 millimeter on a 3/8 Milwaukee. I have some multi-vehicle grease. I have some brake cleaner, some rags, and here I have a nice disc brake. When you lift the vehicle up and you have the tire with no weight on the ground, what you want to do is take one hand on top of the wheel, one hand on the bottom, and you want to lift up and down. And if you have any play in the wheel, then you have a ball joint issue. Really what you're looking at is the connection between the knuckle and the rest of the steering system in the vehicle. I can also go side to side and see if I have any tie rod play. If I had any harsh clicking or movements or anything like that side to side, I'd be looking at possible worn out tie rods or possible worn out wheel bearings. We have a 22 millimeter socket on a 1/2-inch impact gun to remove the wheel. And once you get the wheel removed, we can jump into removing the caliper, and I'll show you how everything's done. One thing that I like to practice when I'm doing front pads and rotors is after I have the vehicle supported by a jack stand and jacked up properly, I like to turn the wheel to either passenger side if I'm doing the driver or the driver side if I'm doing the passenger. The reason why I do that is it allows me to have better access to my fasteners on the back side of the caliper, and it makes the whole job easier, have more space to get impact room back here. So what I have going on is a 13 millimeter on my 3/8 Milwaukee impact, and I'm going after the slider pin bolts on the back side of the caliper to the bracket. I like to separate the caliper from the bracket first so that I have less weight on this line. You never want to let the caliper hang on the line, and that's why I like to separate it, because it's easier to put it in a more secure place. Take my slider. I'm now separating the brake line from the ABS ring. And I'm going to securely place my caliper on this control arm here. That way I don't have any weight on the brake line. So now that I have my caliper out of the way, I'm going to remove the caliper bracket from the brake rotor. I have a 21 millimeter on a 1/2-inch. These guys are tight. So I'm just a little guy, and I like to come up with little tricks to remove super tight fasteners when I don't have a lot of room to get a 1/2-inch impact. And one thing that I like to do is, if I can use my jack for extra leverage, I'm gonna do so. So I'm using my jack now to help loosen these super tight 21 millimeters to a point where I can get them by hand and work them out like that. Up here, I'm not able to get my jack on it. Give her a good palm slap. Once you get these guys removed, the caliper bracket will drop down, and you can now work on removing the front hub assembly. Oh, there it is. So you want to remove the cap for the inside of the wheel bearing and the lock nut assembly, and we're going to clean up all of this grease, make it nice and new for the reassembly. But when you come on in here, what you have going on is a cotter pin that's holding a castle nut. So I'm going to remove this cotter pin here, and I'm going to remove this castle nut that holds the lock nut for the wheel bearing and the races. And here I have a 27 millimeter nut after the cotter pin and the lock nut. So I'm going to carefully remove this. And you want to be careful because the front outermost wheel bearing sometimes will like to pop out on you. And you never want to get that guy in the dirt or anything like that. You want to keep that wheel bearing nice and clean. So I remove my 27mm nut. I'll pop it forward, and I take my hand, and I catch my wheel bearing. Take that guy and I'll set it on my socket rail. I can then remove the rest of the hub assembly. With the hub assembly removed, I now work on removing the old dust and oil seal to get to the inner wheel bearing, and I swap the inner wheel bearing from the old hub assembly to the new hub and rotor assembly. So right here on our spindle, you'll see that we have an excess amount of blue grease. Grease on an axle can come in various different colors. I've seen blue, I've seen red, I've seen clear, I've seen any color on the rainbow. So when you're reinstalling the brake rotor, you want to make sure that you use a high temperature grease. The grease that I have today is going to be the color red. The different ways that people go about removing the old dust seal. They make special tools for it. Some people go with a pry bar. I go with a long 3-foot pry bar and a 4-pound hammer, and I hold brace here and I hit right around this area of the pry bar. Once you have that guy removed, you can work on transferring the bearing from your old rotor assembly to the new rotor assembly. Alrighty, in perfect hospital fashion, I have sterile blue gloves on. If you haven't already gotten upset with me for completing this job without wearing gloves, I have heard you through the camera. I have gloves on now. I'm going to take my red high temperature grease, and I'm going to get 2 fingers full in here, and I'm going to spread it inside the race area for the new bearing that I'm going to lay in. It's very, very important to make sure that you have plenty of bearing grease going on inside of here. Once I got that greased up, I can take this bearing. Now if the grease is super, super nasty, I'll clean the whole bearing out. I'll make sure everything's brand new. In this case, this bearing doesn't feel like it has any drag to it. Everything feels nice and smooth. And this grease, I can tell by the color of the blue, is relatively new. It's not super, super old, so I'm okay with reusing this. So I'm gonna set my bearing in its place, and I'll give it a little bit of extra grease just for some love. I have never heard of there being too much grease on your bearing. After I have that installed, I will take my seal installer and I'll work on installing my new bearing seal. So when installing a new bearing seal, it's extremely important to make sure that your seal installer lines up with the neck on the ring perfectly. If your installer circumference is smaller than the circumference of the outside of the seal, you risk damaging the seal. Any little bit of damage, any bend, kink, or any imperfection in the seal will cause grease to leak while you're going down the road. So it's extremely important to make sure that you have the correct size. After that, it's not a bad idea to take a little bit of grease around the lip just to aid in installation. Once I have the lip all greased up, I'll lay it down as flat as I can get it. And I'll take my installer and I will very carefully tap it down. You want to tap until this area is flush. I'm going to keep going just a little bit more. I see a little bit of a gap between the seal and the hub assembly. I'm going to switch up a size because I can feel this guy wanting to dig in just a little bit. You always want to make sure that you're tapping on the outside lip of the seal. When the area between the seal and the rotor and hub assembly is completely closed and flush, you know that you've driven the seal in all the way and it's time to continue. Before I install the new hub and rotor assembly onto the spindle, I always like to take a fresh rag and clean off this back lip here. This back lip where the metal steps up, that is the mating surface for the bearing seal. And if you have a bunch of grease all over that surface, you're not going to get a good seal, and you'll eventually have grease leaking out from the bearings all over the rotors and the wheels. Another thing that is super, super important and good to do while you're here is clean off the pickup sensor for the ABS tone ring. I like to take a brass and a plastic bristled brush and just kind of help get all of the metal off of the magnet on this guy. You'll notice that the new hub and rotor comes with a new tone ring to replace the old tone ring on the spindle. When installing the new hub and rotor, it is super important to be as smooth and straight as you can when sliding onto the spindle. You don't want to pinch or kink the seal on the spindle or have any tears or binding going on. So I'm going to take my right hand and I'm going to support by the lugs, and I'm going to take my left hand and hold the rotor. And as straight as I can, I'm going to help seat that on. From there, I can take my outer wheel bearing. We like to put them inside, smaller side first, outside like that. We'll work that guy up in there like so. Then you install the washer, and then you install the nut. This guy's a little bit dirty, so I'm going to clean it. Alright, so I cleaned my washer. I went ahead and I cleaned the outer wheel bearing as well. I put some new grease on there. So I slide that guy on. I then take my 27mm nut and I can begin to seat the rotor and the hub onto the spindle. Now there is a procedure for setting the wheel seal onto the spindle. What we want to do is take our 27mm and we want to tighten that nut as far and as tight as we can. You'll notice that the tighter you go, you may hit a point where the wheel stops spinning as freely. I believe the torque on this is around 200 foot-pounds. And what I'm doing is, I'm tightening the hub assembly super tight onto the spindle to make sure that that seal is getting up on that back lip that we cleaned prior. Now you notice it's all the way tight and I cannot spin it. So I'm going to do a pre-adjustment before I install the wheel. I back off about a half a turn. Now I can spin freely and I don't have any play, I don't have any noise or anything like that. So I like to go just a little bit more tight until I hear a little bit of rubbing. There's a little bit of rubbing going on there. So then I back it out just a little bit. And I'll keep it there. I'll install the wheel when I'm done and I will check this bearing seat one more time. After I'm good here, I'll take my lock ring and I'll install the lock ring and I'll install the pin, but I'm gonna do that last after I check this when I'm done. So once I have my pads removed from the caliper bracket, I'm gonna take a trim tool and remove the old clips. The way these clips are installed, one side has a smaller tab and the other side has a bigger tab. You always want the bigger tab on the outside. If the bigger tab finds itself flipped in this direction, see how I have it on the inside? That will rub on your brake rotor and that will cause excess noise and brake wear. So it's very important to make sure that you have these powder tips to the outside. Once I have them removed, I'll take a wire brush and clean the areas that they seat in. Then I'll take my new clips and keep in mind that I want the fat part of the tab on the outside. Once I have the clips installed, I'll lay it down. I like to grease the slider pins on every brake change. So I take the slider pins out, I grab my tub of grease. This is a high temperature red grease, safe for using on brakes. So I dip it in, and then I'll reinstall. If there's any extra grease, I'll wipe it off. So slide this guy on here like so. Grab my rag and wipe off the extra. I'll do the same thing for the bottom pin. I'll make sure that my boot is seated all the way and that I do have sponginess to my slider pins. After that, I take the brake pads. A good rule of thumb for the brake pads is the contour on the pad. I always line up with the contour of the wishbone of the caliper. And I'll take a small dab of grease, something like that amount there and that amount there. Too much grease will work its way onto the rotor over time. So I go and I install. I will clean all of my finger oils and motor oils off of my pads before I install them. And these pads, take note, are not directional. Some pads will say left front, right front. Depends on the vehicle or the brand. So always take a look at your pads and make sure that you're putting them in the right locations. I'll set them in like this. A little tricky sometimes. Boss makes $1, I make a dime. That's why I use the entire can of brake clean every single time. Before I install our new pads in our caliper bracket, I'm going to clean the rotor surface thoroughly with brake cleaner. So now that I have my brake pads cleaned with brake cleaner, I have my caliper bracket clean, I have my slider pins greased, and I have my brakes rotor surface clean. I'm going to take the bolts and I'm going to reinstall the caliper bracket. The way I do it is I just hang the first one so that I can put Loctite on the second one. It is very important to put Loctite on your brake bolts. Otherwise, you will run the risk of them coming out while you're going down the road. So I have my Loctite installed on the bottom. I'm going to put my Loctite on the top. Oop, got Loctite on the rotor. I'm going to clean that. Now that I have Loctite on my caliper bolts, I'm going to take a 21mm on my torque wrench. This is set for 190 foot-pounds. I'm going to torque each bolt accordingly. Alright. Now that I have that torqued, it's time to spread the pistons on the caliper and reinstall the caliper. So what I have going on is I have my dual piston calipers setting on top of the knuckle and the rotor. And I'm going to come to my kit here. You can pick up one of these kits from any Advanced Auto or Harbor Freight. This is a brake pad piston spreader. So I'm going to take my spreader. I believe I want my right hand spreader for today. This kit allows you to easily spread the pistons in the brake caliper without causing any issues. So I take this guy, take my plate, set it down in here, and I'm gonna pick, let's see, I'll pick this guy. Set it there. I like to take an old pad, set it like this. I have no weight on the brake line, and I come in. Essentially what I'm doing is as I twist my T-handle, I'm compressing the sliders for the brake piston. It's very important to do this because when you do a brake job, your new pads are going to be thicker than the old pads, and without doing this, you will not be able to reinstall the caliper. I come to that side, and I switch over to this side. You're going to repeat this process until your old brake pad is pressing flat flush against the caliper. I'm going to switch back one more time. Let's see if we have a fit. So now that I have my pistons compressed, I should be able to slide this guy on. Excuse my sliders. And now I can reach over for my bolts. I'm going to put Loctite on these bolts, and I'm going to tighten them down to 27 foot-pounds. There's two. So now that I have everything reassembled, we have torque specs checked, Loctite checked, we have grease on our pads. I'm gonna reinstall the wheel and I'm gonna finalize my adjustment of the wheel bearing. I'm gonna come in here, install this guy. The reason why I do this with the wheel on is it gives me a little bit more leverage to feel what I have going on. All right, so I'm gonna install the wheel. And now I'm gonna check. And I got no play. It spins freely. So I'm now gonna reinstall my little lock nut. So now that we have our bearing play set, I'm gonna take my little lock nut. You'll notice that it has grooves in it where this pin will slide through the spindle. So I'm gonna install. I have a hole drilled out on my spindle. So I'm gonna take this pin and I'm gonna work it down in. She still doesn't want to go down in there. They get a little hung up sometimes. Let me try giving it another bend. There it is. So once I have my cotter pin dropped in the drilled out hole on my spindle, I can take it and bend it back. Bend one side that way, and bend the other side this way. It's really important that you don't let any of this cotter pin hang out a whole bunch. And what I mean by that is the ends of these cotter pins can sometimes make contact on this grease cap. And when that happens, you're gonna build up a bunch of metal inside the bearing grease area. So it's really important to make sure those guys are pinched all the way in. And I can take my cap and I can reinstall it. On this wheel here, I like to start all the lug nuts by hand. Even though I have a tap and die kit, I don't have all the time in the world. And I notice that my rim is sitting nice and smooth on my brake hub, and so I know it's not pinched or kinked up in any way. It's okay to use the old method of star cross when you're tightening a wheel, but you don't have to do that anymore because they build wheels and hubs hub-centric, so everything sits on a nice groove and it can't get all bent up. Now that they're all tight, we're good to move on to the other side. Now that we finished up with the driver's side, we came over to the passenger and finished that up as well. It was the same exact tools and process. If you like what you saw in today's video, please like, comment, and subscribe. And don't forget to give us any suggestions for future videos that you'd like to see. Now, happy motoring.